Hi there, everyone. It is 1 o'clock. Welcome to the live and interactive ACSA Legislative Lunch Break on a Wednesday, along with Edgar Zaswata, ACSA Senior Director of Policy and Governmental Relations. I'm Naj and Edgar, ACSA Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. We're so happy to have you with us today. Go ahead and jump on our chat, say hello, let us know where you're watching from and what's happening in your district. Edgar, good to see you. I'm disappointed that we don't have you physically in the office because we had this really great idea of having like a camera in the hallway and try and capture you and I in midst show running around through the office and just kind of making it look as fun as possible in here.
I love the SNL like kind of behind the scenes, the walk up onto the stage. I mean, that's, we're maybe still novices a little bit on that end, but there's time to step up our game in terms of our. I'll have to ask you what your entrance song will be.
As if I'm a baseball player or something like that. Yeah, go ahead, folks. Jump in and say hello. Mark Campbell is with us. Our loyal viewer, Angela Shell, is with us as well. We're going to cover a number of topics, and Patti Herrera, Vice President for School Services of California, is going to be on here with us a little bit later to take on the topic of virtual learning. For those of you who were with us on Friday after the May revision came out, thank you for joining us. We had more than 1,000 of you participate. And then, of course, we had a webinar at the end of the day on Friday with the ACSA Governmental Relations team. Edgar, you and your team have had now 5 days to just digest everything that was in the budget. Anything stick out to you now that you guys have had a little bit more time to review it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the initial impressions, have, been solidified, if there's a good way of saying that. Obviously, the big takeaway is that there was a lot of revenue there. There's a lot of billions in investment in one program or another. So I think, big picture, it was a positive budget, right, in terms of investments to schools. The flip side, if there is a flip side, is trying to think about what are the implications of these new investments, of really thinking about what is it going to take to implement this. I think the way we've been talking about it, there's a lot of ambitious stuff there, right? And that's all things that the system will have to now think about, how do we move forward on that. So I think there's some of that piece, but I think this is a good issue to have, or a good problem to have, in terms of having dollars to invest and really thinking about what's the most appropriate way to do that. And I think the third takeaway is kind of what we'll spend some of the lion's share of our time today with Patti talking about. Okay, we've been waiting for months about what was going to be the rules of the game, if you will, for virtual learning, for distance learning for the next year. And now finally the governor has kind of put out their proposal. Even when we were talking last Friday, we didn't have all the details. We just got a little bit more of that information yesterday. And this is kind of the piece that we'll dig in. So folks, for better, for worse, now have the parameters. And I'm sure we're going to get some feedback and comments from our members, how they feel about that and how this impacts their planning process as they go into the next academic year.
I want to say hello to Philip and Tony, Ellen, Steve Collins with us, Deirdre Hoffman. So good to have you guys with us today. Questions and comments on the budget, keep them coming in, and we'll hit the budget as far as the topic a little bit later on. Edgar, as we look through that entire May revision, what is there that our members really need to be aware of as we move through this budget process?
Yeah, it's a great question for this reason. We always try to give the caveat. We live this, and it's easy to oversee that, like, okay, all of our members, frankly, are busy doing their jobs day in, day out, just trying to serve kids, run the schools, and, almost resetting on what does this mean? What is this in the context of the big picture? I think the big thing to look out for is that not all of this is a done deal yet, right? That this is the governor's May revision. It's his proposal. The legislature is now just starting to dig into that and give their perspective about this. Ultimately, it's going to be a negotiated solution. So some of these issues, not just on the investments, but these final rules around distance learning or virtual learning, this is going to be something that all parties are going to have to come together on. So I think the caveat of some of this could still change in the weeks to come, I think is the big piece about just being cautious in terms of how much we look at any given detail and just say, oh, this is how it's going to be.
Yeah, actually, that brings up a good question, Edgar, because those of you who have been loyal viewers of this show, you know that we have lawmakers come on this show all the time. We have the people in those prime positions who've come on here to talk about what's happening in the state capitol and to talk about the importance of advocacy. Edgar, as we move through this process, just remind everybody what the process is and how important their advocacy is right now when it comes to some of the main issues.
Yeah. So governor proposes the May revise, which was a revision from what he proposed in January. So updated revenue information. Every May, governor puts out a new proposal. The legislature now goes into this sprint here over the next 4 to 6 weeks about trying to adopt a budget. The constitutional deadline there, they have to take action by June 15th. So the budget subcommittee hearings in both houses are kind of digging into this, going line by line on every one of these investments. They will offer up, their version, potentially some changes. We have this instrument which called the conference committee, which essentially is put in place to try to reconcile any differences that there may be between the legislative houses. Ultimately, especially given the politics of the days, that we're all the leaders, all three branches are Democrats. They usually come together and will try to hash out those pieces that they may not have complete agreement on. That will ultimately happen by mid-June. There's some subsequent action that takes place to adopt some of this trailer bills. And usually by around July 1st, we have an adopted budget. But all this happens really fast. You mentioned the last piece on advocacy. I'm sure we're going to have some opinions, right? For all the good news, There's always stuff in here that either us as an organization or our members may not think that they hit the right mark on. So I think especially I can anticipate on some of the proposals how it may impact particular schools, or they may have thoughts about this distance learning piece and independent study about how it may impact their current programming. There's definitely opportunity to continue to work with the state, with their policymakers on that end.
And I see a couple of questions coming in, Edgar, and we'll try and tackle those at the close of the show. I'm seeing one from Angela Shell. Charlie Hoffman has a question in related to the budget. So we'll go ahead and tackle some of those a little bit later on in the show. But let's talk about virtual learning because it's an important topic. It's a topic you and I, Edgar, are hearing a lot about when it comes to meetings that we are in. So we wanted to bring in an expert on this. Patti Herrera, Vice President over at School Services of California, our good friends over at School Services. Patti, so honored to have you on the show. Let's start with the May revision. Let's talk big picture perspectives on the May revision. What are the takeaways for you and your colleagues over at School Services related to this May revision?
First of all, thanks so much for inviting me and having us here. We always appreciate the opportunity to engage with our local leaders across the state. So just thanks very much. Big takeaways, as Edgar mentioned, is first and foremost bountiful May revision, right? Nobody can question or even challenge the abundance that the governor included in his May revision. And frankly, that's just because the economy is doing so well. No one anticipated, 6 months ago that the economic recovery would be a V-shaped recovery. And that's really what is allowing Governor Newsom to make the investments that he's making across the board. In addition, though, to, that or what accompanies that bounty, from our vantage point, is quite a few of what we would call categorical programs, right, that the governor is advancing. Of course, he would argue that he's advancing it through a very strong equity framework, to really put resources in the hands of school districts to help students who are underadvantaged or who have been historically underserved. In our public school system. And so, we see that, but as school district leaders, they have to navigate the rules and regulations and the timing of those investments across a panoply of programs in the state of California. And that can be very challenging when you're talking about the billions and billions of dollars that they're having to navigate and the various requirements. Two other things that I would note about the May revision is that obviously we see an uptick in this in the funding, but some of us wonder whether or not some of the economic assumptions that the governor is using might be a little aggressive, because we know that, at the macroeconomic level, there's concern around runaway inflation, particularly if at the federal level we see continued economic stimulus in the multi-trillions of dollars, what that could do for inflation across the nation, and what that could, the impact that could potentially have on our economy and on our general fund revenues. So also sort of, we feel like we're nearing a corner where we're not quite sure what the economic picture looks like around the corner. And so maybe some of these assumptions are a little aggressive moving into the out year. One other thing that I would just also say is probably from a major policy perspective, one of the things that the governor included in his May revision is a plan to universalize transitional kindergarten at the end of school year 24-25. So it's a major policy shift for California in terms of creating what the governor called the 14th grade, and really just to ensure that every child, regardless of background, every 4-year-old, regardless of background, has access to a high quality preschool program. We understand, that has serious programmatic and fiscal implications for school districts. And so how do you start to unpack that? So that was a big announcement included in the governor's budget.
Patti, Dr. Herrera, thank you for joining us, and thank you for always being so accessible. You and your team at School Services become great friends of ACSA, and every time we ask you guys to do anything, you guys are always in here helping us out, so appreciate it. So Patti, you talked about all of the investments, and I think you hit it on the head in terms of just so many directions they're going into. And we might seem greedy when we're talking about, that there was a lot of funding, but like I said, it's our jobs to maybe think about the things that maybe weren't included, or maybe they didn't necessarily hit the right mark. From your perspective, any omissions or anything that is stark that there wasn't an investment in, or maybe they decided not to take on, that wasn't part of this proposal?
Two big ones from our perspective, and they were from my perspective, they were missed opportunities. When you're talking about the level of funding that we're experiencing in the state of California, there were real opportunities to help with fiscal stability and really help LEAs build their fiscal resilience into the future. And so what we mean by that is that the governor didn't buy down the full amount of deferred state payments for K-12. He bought down the deferred payments for community colleges in total. And I understand that, relatively speaking, that's much smaller than K-12 deferrals, but he still leaves $2.6 billion on the books for K-12 deferrals in his May revision. And for a lot of school districts that can potentially have some cash flow effects. We know that that's moderated or mitigated by the influx of, frankly, federal funds and the early action investments that were passed back in March. Understanding that mitigation, but we actually think that now is the time to buy down those deferrals. We don't know when the next economic recession is going to hit, and we need those budgetary tools so we don't have to make cuts to education in those years ahead. Now, of course, none of us want a recession, but recessionary cycles are just part of the economic cycle. The other missed opportunity for us is buying down, I think this was one of the questions that came through the chat box, is buying down employer contribution rates for our PERS and STIRS pension systems. We know that in 22-23, districts are going to hit a fiscal wall, and they're going to hit that fiscal wall because the employer rates in our pension systems are due to go up, as at the same time, the protections on funding vis-a-vis an ADA hold harmless are going to go away. They're going to expire. And the confluence of those two factors are going to create what my dear colleague and friend likes to call an emotional event for school districts in terms of looking at their fiscal their fiscal resilience. And so we do think that this was a missed opportunity in the May revision.
Folks, it appears that our chat is filling up with questions. Keep them coming, because Edgar, we may have to do a complete left turn here and start going rapid fire on these questions.
Like, forget our questions.
Seriously, we're gonna end up throwing this paperwork right out of here and just start going with all of our viewers. We will get to your questions, folks. Let me guarantee that. But go ahead and drop more into the chat. Patti, let's talk about distance learning. The field is very anxious right now to get some type of guidance, some type of direction from the governor. Can you summarize what the governor is prioritizing here, proposing here, and what is the analysis like coming from school services?
So the governor is proposing to amend the existing independent study statutes. And I need to be clear that he's proposing to amend what we would colloquially refer to as traditional independent study. There are two types of independent study under law. One is traditional, and one is what we call course-based independent study, which frankly is not as commonly implemented or used throughout the state of California, because it became law back in 2014 and not a lot of folks realize that. So what the governor is proposing is a change to the traditional IS statutes. I think the way that I would frame conceptually what is motivating the administration around these changes is to really ensure the educational quality of independent study programs or virtual learning options for students who desire to participate in that. Of course, what motivates the governor to really look at the independent study statutes is recognizing that there are, I would say, a disproportionate percentage of families who are still not ready to send their students back to school in person in the fall. He wants to set the tone that in-person learning is the default for education and instructional models for next school year, but he has to recognize that there are families, hundreds of thousands of families across California who aren't yet ready for one reason or another. So how do we provide a virtual learning option for those students while maintaining or ensuring quality of instruction? So what we see are what folks, when they read the trailer bill language, what they're going to think is, this is just a carryover of, the distance learning statutes. You see some provisions in there for daily live interaction. You see some provisions in there for synchronous instruction weekly. You see some provisions in there around a plan for tiered re-engagement when a student is underperforming. And that, of course, requires continuous monitoring of student academic progress to be able to make that assessment, whether or not a student needs engagement and additional support. And so all of these things is what the governor is proposing. And I think all of us can understand what is motivating the proposals. I do think that there are some concerns that are starting to emerge around some of the details of those proposals.
Patti, we're going to try a few of these questions before our viewers get upset at us that we're ignoring them here. The first one, I think it was Shannon who asked, and something you kind of touched on right now, and I'm actually impressed with our viewers referencing specific ed code and whatnot. They even had me stumped on some of these.
I love it.
Daily live interaction. So maybe if you could summarize, and I'll rephrase her question, what will the proposed ed code for IAS require the daily live interaction? So I think you could maybe just reiterate what they're proposing, and how do those parameters change independent study as we knew it before in terms of daily live interaction?
Yeah. So I love that you can quote ed code, because as Edgar knows, I can quote ed code because I have this very weird photographic memory. So thank you for that. And so I will say that, this is probably one of the stickier points in the governor's proposed language is daily live interaction and as well as synchronous instruction. Whether or not that holds as it's being currently proposed, I think is a big question mark. I think if I'm a school district who has been running an independent study program and this language is new, I'm trying to evaluate this as to its impact on my current IS program, right? The students who have always used independent study as their educational option because it's the option that works best for them. So if we were to require students to participate vis-a-vis every single day vis-a-vis some kind of live interaction, could that negatively impact their educational option that they've chosen? So the example that I used before in a forum I was with all of you a number of weeks ago, and I like to continue to use, is for the student who has medical therapies, and they have they have medical appointments, maybe sometimes multiple times a week and whatever. And so participating every single day through live interaction is not necessarily going to be viable for that student. And again, you're impacting the educational option for that student. Does it foreclose that educational option for him or her? And I think that's a great question. These are the kinds of questions that folks are asking and posing to the administration as we speak. So there's a lot of question about how do you operationalize live interaction, right? How does the state of California operationalize that? We do know, if you were to go over to since we have our nerds with us, 51749.5, that's the course-based independent study statutes. There is a definition in there for live interaction, not daily live interaction, but a definition for live interaction. And that could give us some idea of what the state means by live interaction. But again, without further clarity or understanding how they plan to operationalize that, I think this is cause for concern.
Patti, I have a question in here from Terry Metzger, who asked, do you think the independent study rules will change for non-classroom based schools, essentially independent study schools? Any changes that you think are forthcoming?
I do, and I don't say that lightly. And the reason why I say that is because and maybe Edgar can weigh in here as well with his political assessment. But when you do a political landscape assessment, where are our lawmakers on this? I don't think that any one of the three parties, whether it's the governor's administration, whether it's the assembly, or whether it's the Senate, are interested in not touching the law. And all of this, of course, is catalyzed by the need to address how do we provide a virtual learning option for our students, for those, especially for those who are not yet ready to come back to school. And no one is interested in extending the distance learning statutes that became law with SB 98. So what do we do? So I don't think that folks are, I have said this. I don't think you need to do anything to IS, independent study. I think that the statutes are sufficient to give districts the authority to create high quality virtual learning options for their students and generate funding for them. But the political landscape differs from my legal analysis, right? That's a legal analysis. Does a law allow us to do this? But politically, I don't think our lawmakers are where I am. Would that make sense? Would you agree with that, Edgar?
I think you're on. I think you're spot on that piece in terms of just what some of this is from a very policy perspective, but we also know what the tenor of the conversation has been politically around some of these issues and why we're even having this conversation, with some of the concerns as some of the policymakers, right or wrong, as they perceive them, both with distance learning or non-classroom based schools. So I would concur with your assessment. Patti, next question. I actually combined two questions. I know we had a question from one of our ACSA leaders, Charlie Hoffman. I think Stan asked something similar about what stirs purse. We referenced it as one of the things that was not included. What do you get the sense? I mean, just from what we're hearing, I know there's been a couple budget subcommittees. What's your perspective? Is there any chance that we could see some movement on this? Or what do you think what's your opinion about what the reaction on this will be from the legislators and the governor, for that matter?
So we know that the Legislative Analyst's Office has identified this also. I don't think they use these terms, missed opportunity, but we know that the Legislative Analyst's Office has been talking about this, but also reiterated it in their initial impressions of the governor's May revision as, hey, they recognize that school districts are going to hit a fiscal wall, as we talked about earlier. So that's great, because when they're testifying at hearings and are asked to opine on the governor's May revision proposals, they're bringing that up as, is there an opportunity for us to help stabilize or build the fiscal resilience of school districts by buying down PERS and STIRS rates? So that's great. I will say that already in budget hearings, there are, I wouldn't say it's quite a chorus, but there are key members of the legislature, both on the Senate and the Assembly side, who have identified this as an area. And I think one of the things that I would, and I'm sure all of my colleagues at ACSA would agree with this, is we need to be careful, right? We don't want Proposition 98 resources to be used for this, although we have plenty of Proposition 98 resources. We want an extension of prior year investments from the general fund, or even better, from federal dollars. The state has received, almost $30 billion in flexible federal stimulus funds. And couldn't the state take a few billion of that, buy down some employer contribution rates for PERS and STIRS for us, and call it a day, right? I mean, the governor made a very, very big statement in his press conference on the May revision about this historic investment to buy down pension liability. Then when we opened the A pages to page 113 or 118, whatever it was, and we looked and we're like, this is buying down the state's debt, not the school district's debt, and it wasn't anything above what he had been proposing. So I do think that this is a topic that's going to gain traction. Whether or not it gets across the finish line in negotiations, I think it's too early to tell.
Andy, let me ask you, because a lot of we've heard a lot of talking from school leaders who are trying to use the existing independent study provisions to develop their virtual offerings for next year. We know that there's a lot of preparation that's already taking place as we head into the new academic year. So how do you see some of this playing out, and what advice would school services be delivering right now to our education leaders as they're putting their programs together?
Let me just start by saying I think it's wise to start from the independent study statutes. I don't think that in conversations that Edgar and I are both in Sacramento, it doesn't appear that there's another alternative for a virtual school option for next year outside of independent study. So if you're using the legal framework of IS to design your programs and to start, and I don't mean programmatic design or curricular design, I mean staffing designs and and things like that. I think that that's a wise thing to do. What I would certainly advise folks to do is to open the trailer bill language to those sections that your colleagues have put in the chat box and start looking at them. It doesn't, while these additional provisions can be significant, it can add significant requirements to your independent study program, it will not upset the foundational design of your independent study or virtual learning option, because the framework is there. It's a question about documentation. It's a question about maintenance of record. It's a question about frequency of contact with that, with your student, and then your intervention strategies, right? Those you might need to attend to as these conversations in the budget mature and are ultimately finalized. And then in the middle of June, you're going to have a much clearer picture about what that is and how you make those fine tweaks to your program, fine but significant tweaks to your program. But using the IS statutes as your legal framework for building and designing, I think is the right thing to do.
Patti, one of the things I appreciate about you, you know a lot about a lot of things. Well, I'm going to throw topics on you right now, adult ed, and we have a contingent of our members and viewers who had asked a question about adult ed, and I lost track of the question, or Larry Ann, why the adult ed program only get funded at a 1.7% COLA. So that's a pretty technical question, but maybe.
Which is why, Patti, you're getting it. It's a technical question.
Yeah,
so
no problem.
I didn't want it.
I would say, don't not feel the love, right? There's a lot of people in categorical programs who are also not feeling the love. Among them would be like your child development programs, whose reimbursement rates are also not getting the compounded or mega COLA, right? Because in the very least, you're like, hey, can you give me the compounded COLA? My COLA got suspended last year, and so I'm behind my rate is behind the cost of service, right, by at least a year, because the 2.31% COLA from last year was suspended. So in the very least, can you make up for last year, right? And so of course the governor is giving the mega COLA to the LCFF and is not spreading that love evenly either. So I would just say that, like, you're not alone. They're all of the categorical programs outside of the LCFF, and except for special education. Special education AB 602 dollars do get the compounded COLA. So they get restored from the suspended COLA from last year, but they don't get the mega COLA of adding the additional 1% on top of that. But all other categorical programs in the state for K-12, and I think this is also true for community colleges, are only getting what we call the budget year statutory COLA, which is the 1.7%.
One final question for you, Patti, as we cross the bottom of the hour here. One of our most loyal viewers, Angela Shell, asked the question, what are the early reactions from the legislature on the May revision? We're 5 days past the May revision coming out, but what are you hearing as far as those initial reactions from lawmakers?
I'd love Edgar to weigh in on this as well. I mean, I think that it's a lot for them to consume. When the Department of Finance goes up to the dais, or the virtual dais, and presents the governor's May revision, we gotta like set aside 2 hours just for them to do all of the investments, right? And so it's a lot for them to consume. I think that each of them come into the budget hearings with their own priorities already in their mind. Some of them it's CTE. I want to see additional investments across career technical education, and they're hearing from all of the constituents about, hey, what about me? What about me? Including adult ed, for example. So what about me? What about me? And they're trying to process it. I don't think that it's too early to say where folks are going to land, right? Where are the identifying the very narrow places where the negotiations are going to land. So for example, the governor has $2.9 billion in one-time money on teacher investments. And nobody would argue that we need to invest in the teacher pipeline. No one would argue that. I think there's a question about whether or not do we need 2.9 billion, right? And so is that going to be vulnerable as it, moving into the next few weeks in negotiations, and what would be the trade-off? What would be the priorities to fund with that? But again, I mean, I think maybe I'll just wrap this up because I know that we're out of time or coming out of time, and want to make sure folks who have other questions can answer. Is I have to stop myself as I get too critical about any of this. Is, you know what, Patti? Last year we were staring down cuts. We were staring down $12 billion of deferrals. We were actually even contemplating whether or not the LCFF was going to get cut by 10%. So this is a good place to be. Like, us arguing about what to do with billions of dollars is a good place to be, right?
Yeah, no, I would echo what Patti just said. I mean, that's why the day after the budget comes out, all of the legislator press releases is, touting all the money, and giving themselves thanks, giving the state thanks, obviously applauding the governor's investment. So that's like the big reaction, right? Happy that we're talking about revenues as opposed to a year ago when we were talking about cuts. I think the devil's going to be in the details, right? Where they might agree with the overall approach of the investments, or the fact that we're giving a lot of money in a number of different programs. It's now the particulars. How's this transitional kindergarten program going to work? There's questions about proposals around the concentration grant, which I'm sure we'll talk about more in the weeks to come, how they impact in their respective districts, legislative districts, school districts. So I think, like Patti said, they all come in with their own unique perspective. Generally, it's been positive. And also some of these questions about what we dug in here on virtual learning and independent study. And if we're geeking out on this and how technical this is, you can imagine the legislators who are not far from experts on any of this. So them asking just some questions about what's the net effect of this? Does this mean that kids can continue on into distance learning unilaterally, right? So there's a lot of interesting reactions, but I think they're still trying to wrap their heads around this pretty robust proposal.
Yeah, and thank you, Edgar, for bringing up the concentration grant proposal. That is a big one. And I do think that that's going to be very, very controversial. It draws controversy on so many levels. Obviously, for those districts that don't get concentration grant, they're like, hey, what about me? All the ESSER dollars that have come out in those 3 large tranches have gone out through a Title I formula. And, I have percentages of or I have a pretty sizable population of disadvantaged students, and yet, my district is losing out on all of this. So I think the concentration grant proposal is going to draw scrutiny from those folks. From concentration grant districts, it's going to draw scrutiny because there's restrictions on the use of those dollars to buy personnel, and at what I would say are high poverty schools, for the lack of a better term. And the question is, well, I mean, at some point, aren't we going to reach saturation in terms of how many, teachers and staff and, that, we can buy and put on any single campus? And yet this is an ongoing proposal. So I think there's going to be concerns like that. And then you're also just bifurcating the proposal, right? You've got, or the policy where some percentage of the concentration grant is, for all intents and purposes, unrestricted, but some percentages of the concentration grant are restricted. And so how do you navigate that policy as an LEA and make sure that you're not going to run into an audit tripwire? And so I think that's going to draw a lot of debate and scrutiny over the coming weeks. So Edgar, thanks for bringing that up.
Patti, did I understand this correctly when Edgar brought up an education code number, that you are well versed on the specifics of these education code numbers? Because if so, I'm thinking the next time you come on here, Edgar and I need to just start coming up with some ed code numbers and see if you can come up with them.
I do. I get teased all the time because I do have this weird photographic memory. And so and then I want to tell people where it is so that they don't have to trust me. They can just go look at the law for themselves. So
Edgar, I think we've just found
I do not have a photographic memory, and I do not remember any ed code. So this is why we keep people like Patti around. I would lose at that challenge in that battle. So
something tells me, Edgar, we found a perfect guest for our last show of the year to see if we can stump Patti on some of these ed code numbers. Patti Herrera, Vice President, School Services of California. Patti, it's been an honor to have you on the show today. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks, man.
All right, Edgar, we have covered a lot today on independent study and the budget. We have had an incredible number of questions and comments from our viewers. Don't forget, if you like what you saw today or have been seeing, subscribe to us on YouTube, like us, follow us on Facebook. We would love to have you. Love for you to be part of our family. Edgar, I just want to give you a few seconds here to just summarize everything we've been able to talk about and what's ahead as we move forward through this process.
I see Sheldon already trying to stump us there. I'm not going to take the bait. I'm not even going to pretend I know what that means. Final thoughts. As Patti, talked about extensively, there's still some uncertainty here about where some of this stuff is going to land. I think the case we're trying to make to the policymakers, I think that we have to walk this fine line between trying to address, some of the questions, concerns around quality, but also be mindful about where folks are at in the system. And remember, from our perspective, from the administrative perspective, we're trying to meet our families where they're at, right? I don't hear a lot of educators saying that, oh yeah, we think that kids need to be doing virtual learning or be doing distance learning. What we're trying to react to is the understanding that a lot of our families, despite the science, despite the mitigation efforts, either can't or just not willing to go there yet, right? So we, as our folks, just trying to provide to those students, it's really trying to get where we know some of our families are at. And I think that delicate balance is going to be one that we'll see how it plays out in the weeks ahead. And I know we'll be on here trying to give the latest information and maybe calling our folks to put a little pressure when necessary.
I'm gonna hit Sheldon Smith on this. You and I have known Sheldon for a long time. If I'm reading this correctly, he is written in there code 48910K. I'm not exactly sure what the K is, but if I'm correct on pupil rights and responsibilities, in there, Part 20's instruction and services. If I am correct, Sheldon, go ahead and jump quickly into the chat and let me know. If not, we're going to go ahead and pose that one to Patti the next time she comes on here. Oh, wait a minute. Patricia is saying student suspensions.
Okay, you're on something. You're pretty close.
I'm pretty close on this one. Pretty close.
Thanks to Google there.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Google, for being able to help us with that one. Folks, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been great having you here on the show. We are back next week, 1 p.m. live and interactive ACSA Legislative Lunch Break here on ACSA Facebook, ACSA YouTube. For all of you, have a great rest of the day, great rest of the week. We'll see you next week.